Imagine a monster that devours more than 1 trillion liters of water across the American West every single year, turning flowing rivers into lifeless muddy trenches and poisoning every landscape it spreads across. The United States government spent millions of dollars on heavy machinery, chemical treatments, and massive eradication campaigns, yet every effort failed. In the summer of 2001, along the banks of the Bighorn River in the state of Wyoming, scientists decided to gamble on a solution the world had never tried before. The only weapon they brought with them was a tiny beetle, smaller than a grain of rice. They believed that this tiny creature would save millions of hectares of land and restore rivers that were slowly dying. And indeed, it accomplished exactly that. But only a few years later, that very same savior pushed a rare bird species to the brink of extinction. How could such a tiny beetle change the fate of an entire ecosystem? And was the real mistake made by the beetle, or by humanity itself? To understand why the United States was forced to place its hopes on such a tiny beetle, we have to turn the clock back more than 150 years. Before tamarisk appeared, the American West was home to rivers like the Colorado and the Bighorn, which supported one of the richest ecosystems in North America. Stretching for hundreds of kilometers along both riverbanks were vast forests of cottonwood and willow trees. They were not merely native plants, but the very foundation of the entire ecosystem. Their towering canopies kept the water cool beneath the scorching heat. Their roots anchored the soil to prevent erosion, and their aging trunks and natural cavities provided homes for hundreds of species of birds, insects, and other wildlife. Among them was the southwestern willow flycatcher, a tiny bird whose fate would later become inseparably linked to the story we are telling. For thousands of years, this ecosystem functioned almost entirely on its own. Every spring, melting mountain snow fed seasonal floods that carried nutrient-rich sediment onto the riverbanks, allowing cottonwood and willow forests to regenerate once again. It was a cycle that seemed impossible to break, until humanity decided to improve nature. By the middle of the 19th century, waves of settlers were flooding into the American West. They brought railroads, farms, and new towns that sprang up along the rivers, but the more they developed the region, the more they faced a serious problem. Riverbanks were constantly collapsing, washing away land, and threatening the structures they had just built. Engineers needed a plant strong enough to hold the soil in place, and they found tamarisk, also known as salt cedar. Native to harsh desert regions stretching from the Mediterranean to Central Asia, tamarisk seemed almost unfamiliar with the very meaning of the word harsh. It could endure drought, extreme heat, and salty soil, while continuing to grow in places where many other plants could not survive. At first, tamarisk was introduced into the United States only as an ornamental plant, but before long, authorities began planting it extensively along riverbanks to prevent erosion. By the 1930s, when the Dust Bowl disaster turned millions of hectares of farmland into seas of dust, tamarisk was once again seen as a savior. People planted it in enormous windbreaks, believing they had finally found the answer to the unforgiving environment of the American West. But there was one thing they did not know. In the United States, tamarisk had almost no natural enemies, and that was the moment the monster began to awaken. Only a few decades later, the outcome no one had wanted finally occurred. Tamarisk began escaping from gardens and riverside projects, then spreading at an astonishing speed. Each mature tree could release up to 500,000 seeds every year. Carried by the wind and flowing water, they quickly took root on almost any patch of moist soil. From a tree planted to protect riverbanks, tamarisk gradually became the dominant force. It covered the watersheds of the Colorado, Rio Grande, Virgin, and Bighorn rivers, occupying more than 3 million acres across the American West. But what truly alarmed scientists was not its growth rate, but its ability to consume water. The roots of tamarisk could reach as deep as 30 meters, silently drawing groundwater day and night like enormous pumps. Many studies estimated that the water consumed by this species caused economic losses equivalent to between 133 million and 285 million United States dollars every year in the American West alone. And it did not stop there. Tamarisk also transformed the surrounding habitat. It absorbed water while retaining salt in its leaves. When those leaves fell, the salt gradually accumulated on the ground, making it impossible for many native plant species to continue growing. Cottonwood and willow forests disappeared one after another. Birds abandoned the area. Groundwater levels fell. Rivers that had once sustained entire ecosystems were now covered by an invasive tree that seemed almost impossible to destroy. The United States realized that it was no longer fighting a plant, it was fighting a biological disaster, and every method attempted afterward ended in failure. By the 1960s, the United States government was forced to admit a bitter truth: it had failed. Bulldozers could clear an entire tamarisk forest, but if only a few root fragments remained, the trees would grow back before long. Chemical treatments were no better. Millions of liters of herbicide were sprayed along the rivers, only to contaminate water supplies, drive costs ever higher, and leave tamarisk continuing to spread. The more they tried to destroy it, the more it returned. That was when the United States Department of Agriculture, or the USDA, decided to take a completely different approach. Instead of fighting tamarisk with machinery or chemicals, they wanted to use nature itself to defeat nature. A program was launched to search for the natural enemies of tamarisk. Scientists traveled across Europe and Central Asia. The native range of the plant, they discovered more than 300 insect species capable of feeding on tamarisk. But almost all of them were rejected. If even one species released in the United States switched to feeding on corn, wheat, or native plants, the country could face a disaster even greater than tamarisk itself. So, the testing continued year after year. Every candidate had to pass hundreds of strict examinations in laboratories and quarantine facilities. After nearly 30 years, they finally found the perfect candidate. It was Diorhabda, a leaf beetle smaller than a grain of rice that fed almost exclusively on tamarisk. In 1996, after decades of risk assessment, the USDA officially gave the green light to a plan it believed would change history. But no one realized that from that very moment, they had also begun one of the largest biological gambles ever attempted on American soil. In the summer of 2001, after years of preparation, the first Diorhabda beetles were released at 10 experimental sites across 6 states in the American West. Along the banks of the Bighorn River in Wyoming, scientists carefully placed the tiny beetles onto tamarisk branches covering both sides of the river, then quietly waited. Yet for many weeks, almost nothing changed. The tamarisk remained as green and healthy as before, while the tiny beetles seemed to make no difference at all. Many people began to suspect that the project, which had lasted nearly 30 years, had reached a dead end. But they had underestimated both tamarisk and the beetle created to destroy it. Diorhabda was not a weapon of instant destruction. A single wave of feeding could strip tamarisk of its leaves, but it could not kill the tree. Only a few weeks later, fresh green shoots would grow back. To defeat tamarisk, the beetles had to repeat the attack across many generations, summer after summer, until the enormous root system underground exhausted its stored nutrients. And then, after exactly 5 years, the moment scientists had been waiting for finally arrived. Beginning in 2006, lush green stretches of tamarisk forest started turning grayish-brown. Thousands of hectares of trees were stripped bare, allowing sunlight to reach the ground for the first time in decades. Native grasses gradually returned, young willow trees began to grow, and tamarisk coverage in many areas fell by nearly half. Environmental managers believed they had finally discovered the answer to one of the largest biological invasions in United States history. They even predicted that the beetles could eliminate between 70 and 85% of tamarisk across the entire American West. Everything suggested that humanity had finally won. But at that very moment, something strange was quietly taking place inside those tiny beetles. Something no scientist had ever predicted. Scientists once believed they had calculated every possible outcome. Diorhabda was brought in from cold regions of northern China and Kazakhstan, where its life cycle depended entirely on the length of daylight. When the days began to shorten at the end of summer, the beetles would stop reproducing, burrow underground, and enter hibernation until the following spring. Because of this characteristic, experts insisted that Diorhabda would be unable to survive south of the 38th parallel. If the beetles moved into regions with different daylight patterns, they would enter hibernation too early and die before they had a chance to reproduce. Scientists believed this was a perfect natural barrier. But nature has never operated according to human expectations. In less than 10 years, wild Diorhabda populations began to change. They delayed the onset of hibernation, extended their breeding season, and remained active far later than their ancestors. Beetle populations released in different states also encountered one another, interbred, and produced new generations that were better adapted to the warmer climate of the South. What had once been considered impossible finally happened. Diorhabda crossed the 38th parallel, continued spreading into Arizona, New Mexico, and Texas, then advanced toward the Mexican border. No one transported them there. They expanded their territory through their own ability to evolve. Humans once believed they were controlling an insect species. In reality, they had merely opened the door for natural selection to operate faster than anyone had predicted. And it was this southward expansion that led to a consequence no one had foreseen. In the southern United States lives a small bird known as the southwestern willow flycatcher. Since the mid-1990s, it had been listed as an endangered species because native willow forests were steadily disappearing after dams were built. To survive, the bird was forced to adapt. When the willow forests vanished, it began building nests in dense tamarisk thickets. The plant, once regarded as an invader, had unintentionally become its final refuge. Then Diorhabda arrived. Right in the middle of the breeding season, millions of beetles stripped the tamarisk of its leaves all at once. Within only a few days, green canopies became bare, lifeless branches, exposing the nests beneath the scorching desert sun. In 2009, along the Virgin River in the state of Utah, researchers recorded that 13 out of 15 nests in the area failed completely. Eggs were ruined by the heat, while nestlings became prey because there was no longer any foliage to protect them. The most painful part was that all of it had been caused by the very program humans had created to save the ecosystem. In 2010, the United States Department of Agriculture was forced to halt the Diorhabda release program across all 13 states. A conservation organization later sued the government, arguing that the program directly threatened the rare bird. From the savior of dying rivers, Diorhabda became the center of one of the greatest controversies in the history of biological control. After years of research, scientists were finally forced to accept the reality that Diorhabda could not completely eliminate tamarisk. As the amount of tamarisk declined, the beetles' food supply also began to disappear. Their populations fell, while the surviving tamarisk stumps continued to sprout and cover the riverbanks with green growth once again. The battle between the two species produced no absolute winner, only a new cycle of balance. More importantly, destroying tamarisk did not mean that cottonwood forests would automatically return. For more than a century, humans had built dams, redirected water flows, and completely altered the natural behavior of the rivers. The spring floods that once carried sediment and created the conditions for cottonwood seeds to germinate had almost disappeared. Without those floods, the open ground left behind after tamarisk died could easily be taken over by other invasive weeds. The beetle could only open the door, but for the entire ecosystem to recover, the river itself was the deciding factor. In places where natural water flows were restored, cottonwood and willow trees gradually began to return. Birds came back. Riverside wildlife recovered as well. This showed that nature still possessed the ability to heal itself, as long as humans restored the conditions it had always depended on. More than 150 years ago, humans brought tamarisk to the United States in the hope of protecting the land. More than a century later, they introduced a beetle from the other side of the world to correct that very mistake. None of them intended to destroy nature, but every decision, even one made with good intentions, created chain reactions that no one could fully calculate. The story of tamarisk and diorhabda is not merely a battle between a plant and an insect. It is a reminder that nature is not a machine whose individual parts humans can freely remove and replace. Every link is connected to countless others, and changing even one small detail can cause the entire system to operate in a completely different way. Perhaps the greatest lesson is not whether humanity was right or wrong, but that we must become more humble before the laws of nature. Do you think using one invasive species to control another invasive species is the right solution? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy stories about science and nature like this one, do not forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next video.